keep adjusting. All right. Hangout is live. Just as I keep getting self-conscious about the lighting on my own camera. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Watching 100 Movies. I'm Christiana Ellis.
And I'm Mike and Christiana.
We are making our way through the American Film Institute's top 100 American movies. We've been doing it for a long time. We've made our way to number 30 and number 29. We're going to talk about those movies tonight.
Yes.
Number 30 is Apocalypse Now. Number 29 is Double Indemnity. But given that Apocalypse Now comes first, let's talk about it. So,
yes.
Let me, we'll first briefly, maybe we'll get into the more detail about it, but, you know, we talked briefly last time about the idea of watching both versions, Apocalypse Now original and Apocalypse Now Redux. I did watch both versions, but I don't know that everybody needs to. We can still talk about it. Did you end up watching Redux also or not?
I did not. So part of the decision was, I mean, there were two parts to this decision that kind of relate to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I had fully intended. I brought it up. I thought it would be good to watch and do the comparisons. Like in theory, that sounded great. It's been a long time since I've seen this movie. Even without the Redux, it is a significant time investment.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't mind that time investment when I watched the original. I fell right back into the story. All the things that I love about this movie were there, and it was so satisfying that it felt more like a chore for this conversation to watch the Redux. I didn't need it because I was satisfied with what I'd watched. And then when I was looking at the time constraints, I'm just finding 3 hours to watch a movie when I'm at one of the busier parts in my job. That became stressful. So just deciding to not watch it and be satisfied and happy was good for a lot of reasons, because I was able to, I almost felt like if I had watched Redux, the stress of finding the time to allocate to it and the feeling of a chore of watching it might have also depreciated from my enjoyment of going back and revisiting the original version. And so I'm happy with this decision. But sure. I'm glad you watched both so that you can talk about the differences, because I have seen both. So I will be.
That's what I was going to ask, is if you have actually seen Redux or if it's just you just didn't watch it this time.
No, I have seen it. Yeah.
Yeah. So which is fine, just because I think we can get into more detail about this. But at a very high level, I think the original version is better. I think Redux is interesting and worth seeing if you haven't, but I definitely prefer the original version.
Yes.
By a pretty wide margin.
Yeah, there was actually a time when I thought that I might actually go watch Hearts of Darkness, knowing that you had watched Redux, and we could talk.
I watched Hearts of Darkness too.
Oh, you did? Okay. Well, you really went all in for this.
I sure did. Yeah.
But I have also seen Hearts of Darkness, so I'm familiar with that. When we talk about those type parts of the movie,
yeah.
I mean, and I think that right there, the fact that Hearts of Darkness exists is part of why, like, what is so powerful about this movie. I mean, this is a movie that merited a full-length documentary about making it because of the stress and the craftsmanship and like just how they poured themselves into this project. It was interesting enough to generate a whole 2 hours of a making of, which is normally reserved for like a 15-minute, we've got to kill time in HBO before we hit the top of the hour.
Right. Well, see, the thing is, it's like our current era, the idea of having a documentary about the making of a movie doesn't even really seem like that big a deal. Like, you know, they put together special features type of stuff on every other blockbuster that comes out anymore, it seems like. But this was a documentary made, and I think the documentary I mean, it was obviously filmed during the filming of the original movie. I don't remember when it came out. I don't have that information handy right now, but the idea of making a documentary about the making of a movie at the time that this documentary was made was far more unusual.
Yes.
Also, just interesting to note, almost all the footage filmed by Francis Ford Coppola's wife.
Yes.
On location. So let's just briefly, for anyone not familiar at all with the movie, Apocalypse Now is a 1979 war movie set in the Vietnam War, but loosely based on a story called Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, in which someone travels up the Congo River in Africa to find this guy who's supposed to be an ivory trader, but seems to go native. Now that story has been transplanted into the Vietnam War, where an officer has been sent to go upriver to track down Colonel Kurtz, this high-level officer who's gone rogue. And honestly, I studied Heart of Darkness in AP English in high school. And I've reread it since, but I honestly think that the change of setting brings something new to that same story. It's additive, and not just a transposition.
I 100% agree. And part of that might be just because it makes it more relatable to us, because we weren't in Vietnam. We are familiar with the Vietnam War and all the things that were going on there. And so that's what I really love about it, is it really tackled the themes that are in Heart of Darkness, which are, universal themes of, corruption by circumstance. It's almost Fight Club.
Yeah.
What happens when, you take something that is inspirational and effective, but sort of outside the norm, and you're rewarded for that, to when you get corrupted by that same process to the point where you are no longer, where you're not just effectively outside the binds of society, like you are now so far beyond it that it's become a problem.
Right. It all of that, and the idea that there is good and evil in people, but that sometimes circumstances really put pressure on that, where differing expectations coming from different sides force you in different directions, and there's almost no sane response to that pressure. And so the different ways that people crack along those lines is kind of like, how is their humanity defined? It's, well, how do they go insane under these circumstances? Because no one will manage to avoid that.
Right. And what made Heart of Darkness such a powerful story wasn't just, tapping into that, because it tells it from a different perspective of, then again, like Fight Club, where you're tapping into the person who it happened to. We're not watching this from Kurtz's perspective.
Right.
What we are seeing it is from Willard, right? Willard.
Well, so in the original story, the character traveling up to see Kurtz is named Marlowe, but it's actually framed in the story as though the narrator is relating the story they heard this guy tell. So in Heart of Darkness, our primary narrator is repeating the story he heard this guy Marlowe tell him once.
Right, to kind of distance us from it a little bit and watch and be a third-party observer, which by the nature of the medium of the movie, even though Willard is our narrator, by us watching it, we essentially become the storyteller in Heart of Darkness. Like, because it's just the way that, we're now observing what that narrator observed, but we're seeing Willard tell us the story. But
because I'm amusing. Everything you're saying makes sense. I'm just amused because we talked briefly about the lighting before we started, and as the sun is setting, it's changing, and so right now you got this weird 3/4 shadow thing going on where it's like this part of your face is lit up bright.
I don't know if there's a solution to that. Is it if I go
and just slightly different angle, and I'm sure it'll continue to evolve as we go. I think you almost might be. Are you going to be squinting into the sun? Oh, actually, you're not bad there.
Okay.
All right.
So we'll try this for a little bit.
Okay, so in any case, I didn't mean to distract from what you're saying in terms of the themes, but I mean, overall, it's a movie set in the Vietnam War, and this is an excellent movie, I think. Well, I guess for that matter, so are the other Vietnam War movies that are on this list. You know, Full Metal Jacket and Platoon are good for having that discussion of, is it possible to make an anti-war movie? Because this movie is certainly trying, and yet there are still current stories of Marines excitedly cheering on the Ride of the Valkyries sequence and thinking, this is badass, this is awesome. And to an extent, you get it, right? I mean, it's hard not to understand that feeling, even though the movie is trying to kind of show us the lure of that at the same time as saying it's crazy.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the same thing. That's why, like, well, I don't think Fight Club is on the level of this movie. I do often think of that when I watch this movie, because that's the point. You almost have to think, even though we sit here and kind of look back and be like, oh, well, they're interpreting it wrong. Like, but that also means it was effective because it's supposed to feel like a scene that you're supposed to cheer. Mm-hmm. That's what makes the transition and the, looking at it from the outside so much more powerful when you actually pay attention.
Right. So overall, over the course of this movie, as Captain Willard is the character's name, played by Martin Sheen in this movie, he gets orders and is told that this Air Force colonel, is it Air Force or is it, it's airborne, right?
Yeah, he's a Green Beret.
Green Beret. So he's told this guy, Kurtz, was like cream of the crop, best of the best, one of our best possible guys out here. And yet he has gone into the jungle and he has gone totally bonkers out there. And he is so out of the range of acceptable behavior that we need you to kill him. We need you to assassinate an American officer. And it's obviously a very top secret mission, but it's framed even as he gets these orders of like his first reaction to it, in voiceover after taking the mission is basically to say, that seems pretty crazy, but what else am I going to do? This is what I do, is I do missions like this. And if this is the one they're giving me, then that's what I'll do. But I think his immediate response is, we're in a war and they want me to assassinate him because he killed someone.
Right.
And he's just sort of thinking, that seems like this is a messed up thing right from the get-go. But so he makes his journey up the river, experiences lots of different sort of episodic slivers of the war experience on the way, all of it kind of framed as reflections of like, it's almost this inherent unasked question in every sequence. Is this what Kurtz saw? What did he think about this? How would this influence him? What would he think of this? And what's he going to be like when we get there? Is this constant through line, even as we're seeing all of these things that don't necessarily tie directly to Kurtz.
Right.
And then at sort of the climactic sequence, we arrive, we meet Kurtz, played by Marlon Brando. He is definitely out there, and it ties into that whole struggle of, I mean, ultimately, like the on the nose theme is the idea that they want him to be effective at fighting the war, But then when he does the things that make him effective at fighting the war, they say he becomes a monster and that he has to be taken out. But at the same time, he also recognizes that it seems like the only way to actually rationally be good at fighting a war is to sacrifice your own humanity.
Right.
But if you've sacrificed your humanity, then what's even the point? Like, what are you even doing there if you have to sacrifice your humanity to accomplish it? And that whole dilemma of like, if the whole purpose ostensibly of you being there to fight the war supposedly has some humanitarian aspect of it, but you have to sacrifice everything that makes you a person in order to accomplish it, what that push-pull is essentially what drives Kurt's insane. And that same dynamic is what Willard himself is struggling with, which is why he's so obsessed with getting to Kurtz and everything. So that's kind of the plot of the movie if you haven't seen it.
Right.
But in case it wasn't already obvious, I'm really into this movie. And in fact, actually, there was a period where I was borderline obsessed with it for a little while. I wouldn't say that it's not that I stopped liking it as much as I broadened and started liking other things also. Not like I ever only liked this, but it was just like there was a period where just aspects of it really resonated strongly with stuff I was going through, and it was kind of a whole thing. But the point is, I love this movie. I think it's amazing. It's a masterpiece.
Yes.
It did amuse me to realize as I put it on that it's, according to the list, it's only 2 movies after Godfather Part 2, which is the same director. And just thinking about how that one was a movie where I felt like I respect everything about the making of it, except that it just really doesn't click with me on an emotional level in the way that it does, obviously, for other people. And yet then Apocalypse Now, it's like, it's the same director made within, it was Godfather Part 2 came out 1974, I think. Is that right?
Yeah.
And then Apocalypse Now came out in 1979, so they were close together. We learn in Hearts of Darkness, the documentary, that Coppola had been trying to get Apocalypse Now made, but funding was an issue. And part of what allowed him to finally make it was the money he made from Godfather's Parts 1 and 2.
Right.
But just it struck me as interesting to watch 2 Coppola films back to back and just my very different feelings about the 2.
Right, but it gives you some insight if anybody ever talks now about how they respect the craft of Apocalypse Now, but they aren't really cray into it because
sure.
Like my dad's one of those. Like he loves The Godfathers, and he gets why Apocalypse Now is a good movie, but it just doesn't resonate with him.
Yeah.
The same.
Well, and I totally get that. I mean, there are definitely movies that I love where if someone doesn't like it, there's a part of me that feels personally rejected, which is irrational, obviously, but real, in terms of an emotional reaction. But this one, I get it in the sense that I think the way that it resonates for me feels very personal to me, even though I've never been in the military. I've not fought in a war, so I don't have like direct parallel experiences. But I guess it feels personal, that the idea of those themes of wrestling good and evil and the conflict and, insanity versus inhumanity and all of that sort of thing. I don't know. I just find that subject fascinating. And so that's, I think, like, I get why not everyone's necessarily as into those subjects in the same way, which is not a criticism of anyone. It's just a recognition that not everybody likes the same things.
Yeah, and I think, like with him, this may be a good time to bring this up too, is that, something, while he didn't go to Vietnam, he is of the age of when Vietnam was real. So I think there's part of that, when you live through Vietnam, like this might even might resonate too much with certain pieces of it. even if you weren't there, just with people you know and how they, when they went and how they came back, you know, Willard's journey from when, you know, even the snapshot we get at the beginning, like I think that's important too, is that Willard himself, and this is why he's such a good narrator for this story, he is not outside of, you know, he's not like this moral compass.
Oh, definitely not. Yeah.
He's been corrupted as well, which is why why he has that kind of, okay, you want me to go kill this guy moment? I guess that's what I'll do, because he's thinking, but that's exactly what you're after him for, is what I do for you as a living. And I'm so good at it that when I'm restless and not doing it, I can't even stand myself. And I just, you know, drink straight from the bottle and do Tai Chi naked and punch mirrors, you know, like that's the opening of the movie, is that he can't handle downtime.
Right.
Without being always on alert. And because he's been on these missions and assassinating people and been on high alert for so long, and then he's asked to go kill somebody who he doesn't see as that much different from him. And then, of course, the progress of the movie, before I get to my point, is, you know, that Willard sees himself becoming more and more like Kurtz and identifying more and more with him, which is part of what makes it so powerful. Is we essentially get Kurtz's journey without Kurtz telling us. We get it by watching it happen to Willard.
Right.
Why it's redeemable at the end is because Willard makes a different decision at the end. And that's what kind of like ties it all together. But anyway, so if you were around people where you were part of that, and you were, you know, you went to Vietnam and you saw, or you didn't, and you saw people who came back who had been changed, this story of a man changing into those depths resonates maybe a little too much.
Yeah.
And one of his friends, you know, which I said, the point I wanted to make is, who had gone to Vietnam. You know, we were talking one night at a dinner, you know, where long ago, when I was also like really into, you know, I first started really getting into these kind of movies, and I was watching this and everything on this list, and Platoon and this obviously come up as they are Vietnam movies. And I was curious, and I asked him what he thought. He'd been to Vietnam. What did he think of these movies, which I kind of considered the two best Vietnam movies, as someone who didn't go through that era. And he said, the best way I can describe it is that Platoon is basically like, if you want to see like what happened to people, like what happened in Vietnam, Platoon is one of the best movies for understanding that. Like, what did people go through? If you want to understand what it felt like to be in Vietnam, Apocalypse Now is the better movie. Like, those things didn't happen to anybody. I mean, maybe some people, but that's not like the majority of people's Vietnam story. But what makes it resonate so much is that journey that he goes through, and the things that he sees is what it felt like to be there. And I thought that was really, you know, I can't speak to that, but it does, when you think of the two movies, like the tone in which they're told, that makes a lot of sense. Like, this movie is about going on this journey and feeling it, which is why it resonates outside of the Vietnam side of it. Whereas Platoon is very much like, hey, this is the kind of jacked up stuff that happens there. And this is what people went through. It's kind of looking at it more from it's not taking you through it. It's more of observing it and realizing what it was like, you know?
Right. Yeah. That is, I think that's kind of a good summary, I think, of how I view the two, is that Platoon definitely feels more like an observation, versus Apocalypse Now feels more like an experience, if that bit of semantics makes any sense.
It does. I mean, that's what I was trying to describe.
Yeah. So I guess I'm just echoing that I agree with that assessment, that sort of description of it. I think I brought this up when we talked about Platoon, and I can't remember, is Full Metal Jacket actually on this list or not? I can't remember. I think that we maybe discussed that and decided that maybe it wasn't, because it can't be that it's a British film, or, I mean, just because Kubrick's British, I don't know. But maybe it's just not on the list. But in any event, when I was in Intro to Film Studies in college, one of the papers that I've written for a school thing that I was really the most proud of was a paper that I wrote about, it was on the subject of auteur theory, which is obviously a semi-controversial idea anyway, because films are so inherently collaborative that how do you really ever say that it's one person responsible for it. But generally speaking, when you're talking about an auteur film, it would be if there's one person who's primarily responsible for script, direction, and editorial, right? And so you could look at Apocalypse Now, Platoon, and Full Metal Jacket through that lens, even if it's, you know, true or not to greater or lesser degrees, right? In terms of the singular vision. But the idea of how each of these three movies from these three directors on ostensibly the same subject, the Vietnam War, like you look at the different treatments of the war as a way to psychoanalyze the directors, was the purpose of the paper. And so I'm just pleased with myself. So I guess I'm just describing my own paper that I liked. But my assessment in that paper was that if you're looking at it through the lens of what is each director afraid of, like the movies as a depiction of what they're afraid of, that Platoon was about fear of the unknown and just this idea of, you know, the main character who shows up and he, you know, protests, no one tells you how to do anything. You're just there and you don't know what's going on or what you're supposed to do. And then you never really see the enemy that clearly. They're always like these phantoms in the jungle that you can hardly make out. Whereas Full Metal Jacket, I was saying, was about like abusive power. And then Apocalypse Now is a fear about like losing your mind and like losing yourself. So, yeah. So let's talk about some of the notable like sequences and set pieces in this movie. One thing I wanted to get to specifically because it'll come up in the discussion of Redux versus original is that opening sequence you mentioned. Our introduction to Willard as a character is him having a drunken meltdown in a Saigon hotel room because they haven't given him orders yet and he doesn't know what to do. And he's just like you said, he's drinking himself into a stupor and hurting himself. And like, he's a total mess, which contrasts very sharply from his character in the whole rest of the movie. Very deliberately, right? Because the whole idea is like he only really feels like he knows who he is anymore when he's in the jungle.
Right.
You know, like the first line of dialogue is Saigon. Shit, I'm still only in Saigon. Because he keeps feeling like I'm supposed to be back in the jungle. That's where I am who I am. That's where I know who I am. But we see how much of a mess he is really inside. And so even when he's acting super cool and calm and even emotionless later, we know how much of a, not a facade exactly that is, but we know what the other side of that coin is.
Right.
Right.
It's not a facade. Like when he has a purpose and a focus of a mission, then he can focus, you know, he can be calm, he can be in charge, he can be in control. You know, it's, you know, like, so it's the other side of the coin though, is when he doesn't have a mission, he's not able to occupy his mind.
Right.
When he's not, I mean, we even see it in the beginning, like, that's what I think the scenes of him like laying on the boat and like reading Kurtz's file, like he doesn't like being stuck on the boat going up the river isn't much different than being stuck in the hotel room. I mean, you're outside, I guess,
right? But
because he has something to occupy,
he has a goal now.
Yeah, he has a goal. He has something to focus on. He's not, you know, so now he's serious, and now he doesn't understand why these guys are goofing around and. You know, or he does, but he doesn't like it. Yeah.
And he gets so obsessed with Kurtz because he recognizes in Kurtz, it seems like Kurtz struggled with the same stuff that I'm struggling with. And he was this amazing, super intelligent guy that impressed the hell out of everybody. People thought he was going to be a chief of staff, 4-star general, who knows? But instead, he went totally off the grid into the jungle and is just doing his own thing out there. What would make this guy do that? And what if he's right?
Yeah.
And so the obsession with that decision of like what led him to make that decision, and if put in that same position, what decision would I make, is this total undercurrent of his obsession with Kurtz all throughout the movie. But then, as you know, as he goes on this journey, and as you mentioned, like he meets Kurtz and they have this catharsis, but it's almost really a mutual decision that it's like Kurtz feels like it's important that he did this, but it's killing him in like figuratively. And so that's why he needs Willard to kill him literally, with the hope that he would then go back and tell the story. Right.
Right.
But there's a moment right after Willard has killed Kurtz where he's standing there, you know, dripping with blood, you know, holding the machete and the report on the steps, looking down at this whole like native army that Kurtz had assembled, and they all bow down to him. And there's this very obvious recognition of Willard has a choice now. He could, if he so chose, just take Kurtz's place.
Right.
But he decides not to, and he goes back. And that's the culmination of the journey, is he reaches that decision point and chooses the other path.
Yes. And I think the dialogue between him and Marlon Brando and that climactic scene before that, well, all of those are just so powerful. Like, because you really believe, you buy in, you know, you're spending the whole movie watching Willard identify with Kurtz, start to devolve into it. You're starting to kind of believe, because Willard believes that, okay, this is the best way to win the war. Like, what are they talking about? And then he gets there and he sees everything, and he experiences it, and even before his decision point, you know, there's another really powerful interaction with them when Kurtz is sort of using Willard as like a mirror of himself. Like, he also recognizes that Willard has gone through what he went through. And so he's asking him questions about, you know, he's preaching to him a little bit, but then he's kind of taking these steps to figure out what Willard thinks of him. And there's a point where he says,
oh, sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, it's just the point where he says, you know, talks about his methods and how they're effective. And he says, you know, what do you think of my methods, Willard? Do you think they're effective? And Martin Sheen, or Willard at the time, looks at him and says, frankly, sir, I don't see any method at all. And that's where he's starting to realize that, like, you can actually cross over. And I've decided that this is not an effective way to be a human being, even in a war scenario, because while he's claiming a method, I don't see a method. And he's still not sold, but that's where his like kind of turning point is.
You know, it's interesting. I see that a little bit differently, not that differently, but in a subtle way. Because what I see that first conversation, because that's the first conversation that Willard and Kurtz have, right? When he's just shown up, and he's been brought before Kurtz, and he's on his knees, you know, bound with his hands behind his back, and what we see in the early part of that conversation is Willard, despite his obsession with Kurtz, I think is frankly a little intimidated and retreats a little bit to his mission that he was given, his orders, as opposed to the thing he really wants to know, to understand Kurtz and what's going on with him, right? And so the treating it like, you know, like, are you an assassin? And he says, I'm a soldier. Which, again, like the answer soldier suggests I am a part of this military that has given me orders that I am here to do, right? That's what being a soldier means in that context. And that's why Kurtz wants to disabuse him of that and say, we're not having that conversation. This is between you and me now. Let's leave them out of it, because you and I know they don't get it. But I think maybe you get it. So let's not ignore, let's ignore them. So it's like he said, you're neither. You're an errand boy sent by grocery clerks to collect a bill.
Right. And I love that, like, knocking down and being like, yeah, you can put whatever fancy title you want on it, but I'm going to just cut to the chase here. Like, they asked you to do something, you're going and running and doing it. Like, let's get, like you said, let's get that out of the way.
Right. You know? And so what Kurtz wants more than anything, or maybe not, maybe what he'll settle for, I think what he wants is to be kind of freed from this torment of the dilemma that he is, created for himself. This idea of, to be good at what you're good at means losing your humanity. And if you have given that up, then what value is there in being good at what you're doing? And I think so. This dilemma that Kurtz is conflicted, right? Like, he doesn't think that I have definitely figured out the right answer. It's more a matter of, like, he thinks he sees what needs to be done and that he should do it, but it hurts him to do it. It's like when we see his report after Willard kills him. It's this long typed report. They're in the middle of this ancient temple in the jungle. This long typewritten report with all these fancy words about tactics and stuff. And then scrawled in red pen across one page is, drop the bomb, exterminate them all.
Yeah.
Because it's that dilemma of, look, like, are we trying to actually play by the rules? Because that won't get us our goal. But our goal is what's mad, right? It's like, if the idea is, so the set piece earlier in it that I think really reflects the most on what I see as that central dynamic is the scene with the boat. It's referred to as a salt pun in the in the documentary and in the sequences and everything. But the boat where they're coming up the river, Chief kind of arbitrarily decides, yeah, we're going to go check that boat for contraband. And Willard actually tells him, like, what are you talking about? That's not what we're doing here. Leave them alone. Who cares? But I think Chief at that point is feeling frustrated with not knowing the real plan. So he decides he's going to do this other job. But then, due to a misunderstanding, the soldiers, these kids, shoot up everybody on the boat. And the one of the people on the boat, this woman, is shot but still alive. And there's this discussion of, like, okay, so they've just killed several innocent people because there was a misunderstanding about a puppy. And now this woman's not dead. She's alive. And they're starting to like try to, stop the bleeding. And they're saying, okay, we're going to turn the boat around and take her downriver. And Willard just shoots her. And everyone hates him for it. But he's kind of just saying, I told you not to stop. Now these people are dead. And you want to pretend like you're the good guy by saving this one woman. You just killed everybody else on this boat. You don't get to pretend like you're the good guy in this sequence, right? And so either you had a job to do and this was important, in which case, who cares if you killed them? Or it matters that they are innocent people and you shouldn't have killed them, in which case, what were you doing in the first place? You know, so and I think that's kind of central to Kurtz's dilemma and the whole idea of America in the Vietnam War, which is there are things you could do to more effectively kill your enemy, but there's a recognition that doing those things to more effectively kill the enemy stops letting you pretend like you're there for noble reasons.
Right.
So what you end up doing is this insane catch-22, to cite another war story, of we have to try to kill them, but we can't do it too effectively, or else we can't pretend that we're doing it for good reasons. And so it's kind of like, okay, do you want to be an effective monster or an ineffective hypocrite? Because those are the two choices there for an American soldier.
Right.
At least that's, you know, as presented in the movie. I don't want to judge anyone who is actually sent there, and you know, it's all complicated. It's all a big mess, right?
That's the whole point, and that's what. Yeah. So.
And so, you know, on the one hand, Willard shooting that woman who could have been saved, that's a Kurtz-like decision, right? You know, that's, you know, to use Mass Effect terminology, he pressed the trigger for the renegade option in that cutscene. But at the same time, it's a recognition of like his frustration and even rage, even though he does it in a very calm way, with the idea that you're going to shoot her and then give her a Band-Aid and pretend like you did a good thing.
Right.
So own the monstrous thing you've done.
Right, because the whole reason she's bleeding to death in the first place is because they shot her up.
Yeah.
So why, you know, and that's what sort of his thing is, like, they look at him like the monster because he's cold and calculated about it. But his mind is like, you already put her in this position. Had you either, you know, and again, he only says you shouldn't have stopped, but had you not stopped, or had you not all been so hair trigger, like, panicky when I'm the cool, calm one, you know, you wouldn't have she wouldn't be in this position.
Right.
And because you put her in this, like, what's the difference at this point? You know?
Right. And not only that, but it's just this reminder of, look, we have an actual mission, and I told you not to stop because it didn't matter on our mission and it was going to interfere with it. And now because it blew up in your face, you want to interfere more with the mission. And I'm telling you, no, the mission still takes priority. You know, so it's like, I think that really kind of sums up this dilemma of, like, was it a good thing to shoot this wounded woman? Well, no, not really. It's not morally defensible in any way.
No, yeah.
But at the same time, it's a rejection of the hypocrisy and self-denial that the others were engaging, which was also bad. But it's again, it's a step towards Kurtz in this ultimate dilemma that the movie is exploring. Right?
Yep.
So some of the other big sequences, I feel like I could talk about this movie for hours and hours, but
I know too, and that's what we'll have to kind of check her.
Some of the other big sequences worth discussing, I think. There is, of course, the Colonel Kilgore sequence, the helicopter attack on the village to Ride of the Valkyries, and then Colonel Kilgore himself, played by Robert Duvall, who has all these quotable lines, you know, I love the smell of napalm in the morning, Charlie don't surf, all that sort of thing. He's clearly an obstacle in this overall journey, but he's also a reflection of a certain type of the insanity that, like, everyone is going insane in their own way in this situation, and his way is to obsess about surfing, of all things.
Right.
And lots of pretense of being compassionate. Like, there's the whole bit where, like, oh, they find this wounded soldier who wants water, and the not the Viet Cong, but the Viet Minh, I guess, were the friendly, the South Vietnamese soldiers, I think. Well, one of them was saying, like, we don't want to give him water. He can drink patty water. He killed a bunch of our guys. And then Kilgore's like, what? If he is that brave, then he'd fight with his guts strapped on, he can drink from my canteen any day. But then he gets distracted a second later and walks away without giving the guy any water.
Right.
Which just shows that it's all just, it's not even skin deep. It's the passing breeze. And he is obsessed with surfing, and he's just this really memorable character. And he's just this horrifying caricature, because it's this element. One of the things Willard says about him is he had this glow about him. You just knew he wouldn't get a scratch here. But then he acts like everybody else is that way too.
Right.
Even though, like, he's doing all these crazy things, like, we're in the middle of a firefight, but I want to see you surf, so I'm going to insist that you strip down to your trunks and go out there with a surfboard, even while bombs are blowing up 20 yards away.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the additions in the Redux version is actually even more of that, including a bit where Willard kind of inexplicably decides to steal Kilgore's surfboard. And that's actually one of the things that it answers the question of, in the original version, there's some shots where you see a surfboard there and you're like, what? Where did that come from? Why is that there? But it's not like it matters that much. So in the Redux version, you see why it's there, because he stole it. But it also, like, there's not really any explanation given of why. And it's almost like it's portrayed as this, like, bonding moment of Willard bonding with the soldiers, and it, like, humanizes him. But frankly, in my opinion, that does not work. That's not what that detracts from the ultimate arc that we want to see Willard go on here.
Right.
Because the whole idea is supposed to be how he's got this dual nature, where he's a total mess in the hotel room and he's a total smooth operator on the boat. So we don't want to see the jokey, practical joke playing Willard. Who cares? Or at least that's how I feel about it.
No, I agree. And again, when I went back and kind of at least looked at the scenes that were in the Redux and kind of thought about my feeling of watching them on the original this time, that this was one that I did not like the edition, just like you did. Mm-hmm. The later ones, where I thought they were good, but I feel like it effectively I think they were good in making it the connection deeper, like some of the stuff on the bridge and with Kurtz, like it deepens like the feeling there. But the original gets the feeling right. Like I didn't leave the scene where he goes to the bridge that they keep blowing up and rebuilding and fighting for. Mm-hmm. With the extra like layer of scene that's in there, like didn't make me all of a sudden understand that scene better. Yeah. Like I knew that was like, because which I guess we should talk about that like just real briefly. That like part of the idea of this story is that as you get closer to the quote unquote heart of darkness, which is what Kurtz is that things become more and more chaotic. There's sort of this layer, like the heart of the jungle is part of what does this. Even though the story is really about what happens to human beings, it uses this guidepost of the deeper you get in the jungle, the closer you get to the heart. And
it's used as a metaphor of traveling into the interior darkness of your own soul, that sort of thing.
So, where they start off on the boat with Chief and all those guys, it's kind of happy-go-lucky. They're just cruising up the river. They're doing this, they're reading. They're surfing behind the boat. Sometimes they smoke some weed. Nothing's really. It's not really a big deal. They're just taking the guy up the river, and then they hit. And the thing with Kilgore is while it's intense, it's still kind of lighthearted. Like it's funny, you know, there's the Charlie don't surf, like all the things that you're cheering about at that point. There is nobody cheering by the time they get to that bridge. You know, you're not cheering, you know, the part where he says like, who's your commanding officer? And the guy looks at him and goes, or who's in charge here? And he looks at him and goes, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like,
yeah, I mean, he comes back to the boat saying there ain't no fucking CO here.
There ain't no fucking CO here. Yeah, like no one's like, yeah, there ain't no fucking CO. Like,
no, it's like it's horrifying. It's this it deliberately evokes this nightmare carnival atmosphere with the strings of lights and the broke down, calliope music playing. It's meant to evoke a nightmare.
Right.
Yeah. And it's one of the reasons I think that it's so like another one of the big sequences that they add in the Redux version is the bit at the French plantation, which I think is interesting as a sequence to watch and think about. But it just doesn't feel like it belongs to me. It totally disrupts the flow of that journey, right? We just come out of that bridge, that nightmare carnival, and in the original version, we're now ready to go into the fog, lose Chief, and then meet Kurtz. But now in Redux, no, we're going to spend 25 minutes having fancy food and talking to people who don't want to leave, and there's a girl, and Willard gets lucky apparently, and it to me, like it's interesting standalone, but it totally disrupts the flow of the movie for me, placed where it is. I mean, there's some interesting content in there, right? I mean, just the idea that he's kind of mystified, like, why wouldn't you leave given what's happening around you? But their position is, it's like, we've made our home here. We're not invaders coming to fight a war and then leave. This is what our home is. But I think one of the other things that I think, looking back on that sequence now, is that it kind of ignores that it's like, French guys, you've been there a generation. You're still kind of invaders. You're colonists, right? Like, you showed up and took some land and said, this is ours now. And then 20 years later, you'd say, this is our home. We fight for it. And it's like, oh, okay. All right. What? You didn't get here first. You got here, 28th. And just because we're 45 doesn't mean that. Anyway, I don't know. So I think this, like I said, I mean, I don't hate that the sequence exists, but it's one of the big reasons that I feel like Redux doesn't work as well. I feel like that sequence is better watched like a deleted scene.
Yeah, which is fair. I mean, when they made this, they didn't really have deleted scenes. It wasn't really an option. So, but yeah, it definitely doesn't. I get what they were trying to do with it, was just throw this, like, you go through this, you get into this nightmare, and then they throw this contrast at you, this juxtaposition of, like, but it doesn't work with where the progress, and because the very next scene, like, we're starting to go with, like, we got the beating heart, like, soundtrack,
right?
When Chief died, like, that works right after the nightmare, because the nightmare says, hey, we've crossed over. So then when you open up and you've got the doom, 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 doom.
Right, because going into it, like, we've just lost Clean, right? And so, like, that's the beginning of that French plantation sequence is our guy is dead, right? You're going to help us bury him. That's like the first thing that happens in that whole sequence. And so I think that's part of why they couldn't really easily move that sequence to any other place in the movie. But it's just this intense thing where the stakes have really started to hit home. Like, they can't maintain themselves as observers anymore. It's They're in it now. They have taken losses. And that's, of course, the point where Chief is really dramatically starting to feel like, what is even this mission you're doing that it's worth clean dying? Right? And even still, you know, Willard is still not willing to tell him everything. I mean, he doesn't spill the details of the whole mission until after Chief dies, when he tells Chef. And, you know, I mean, Lance is there, but he's not really paying attention at that point, right? But so,
Lance is
yeah.
still an important character, I think.
Oh, no, Lance is important. I just mean he's, you know, the idea that Willard is telling him the mission, like he's not engaging with that conversation is all I meant.
No.
Willard, Lance is the one that is totally just like losing himself. I mean, the sequence just before the attack where Clean is killed, that's where he's saying like, hell, this place is better than Disneyland. And he's playing with the smoke grenades and purple haze. Like that's what's happening right before the fight where Clean gets killed.
Right. And I think, but you know, what is important with Lance losing himself is that he is a key part of that end scene in kind of humanizing Kurtz's, you know, army, because he's now he's Willard to Kurtz. He's that to the native army. Yeah. You know, of how they kind of became part of this thing. And so it's not, we can't dismiss it as like, oh, well, yeah, that's what the Vietnamese jungle people, they were the ones that felt, because Lance is caught right up in it. You know, the blonde surfer kid, you know, from America, right part of it. You know, he falls into this under the sway of the whole thing, just like Dennis Hopper's photojournalist character, and like Colby, who, you know, Willard discovers he's actually not the first person to be given this mission. Right. Because the last guy joined up with Kurtz. And so, you know, to use a little bit of D&D phraseology, Lance fails his charisma saving throw. His own inherent personality is not strong enough to overcome the intensity of the experience. And so losing himself in it is easier for him. And so it's actually, I think, you know, in addition to Willard's decision to leave at the end, but also the point that he grabs Lance and brings him along when he could have left him, I think is also an important part of him sort of choosing humanity. Right. So the other sequence that is, you know, I don't know if we have a lot to say about it, except that in the differences between the Redux and the original. So there's the Playboy Bunny sequence that's in the original movie. And then the Redux has a sequence later where they catch up and discover the Playboy bunnies are stranded at this rained out camp, and Willard kind of inexplicably trades some of their fuel to let the guys apparently hang out with / maybe sleep with the bunnies. It's unclear. It's especially unclear why Willard would think that's worth trading 2 drums of fuel for. And then the sequence is just like, you know, the French plantation sequence, I think, is interesting, even if it disrupts the flow. But this sequence, I feel like I don't like it. Yeah. It doesn't feel like it feels out of place, and it's long. For like, how much do we really care about Chef making, like, he is obsessing that it's so exciting to be with Miss December, and she keeps reminding him that she's Miss May. So like this whole idea that he's trying to dress her up as his fantasy, and like this sequence at the same time Lance is doing his thing. Like why? This does not contribute to the journey towards Kurtz, which is the whole point. And it's already a freaking long movie. Exactly. And that's why, again, why I feel so satisfied with the original, because the Playboy Bunny sequence in the original, like, it hits the right beat. Mm-hmm. It's one of the, you know, because what we're moving from is kind of carefree, having fun, even though we know we're in Vietnam, to oh shit, we're in some stuff, but we're still going to try to have fun. to we're going to import fun because we have to try to force people to have fun, but it devolves into sort of this chaotic situation to there's no more fun, even though we have the lights and the carnival music. It's just a chaotic situation to we've now crossed over. Like the Blue Bunny sequence originally, like it just, the beats just hit.
Right.
And when you put these other things in there, which I get why they're like, I get what how they.
Well, like when you watch the documentary Hearts of Darkness, I mean, that whole sequence exists because a hurricane rained out their set and they had to figure out something to shoot.
Right.
And so there's a whole lot of stuff that was shot for the movie. Like, you know, there's talk about how like it was an original assembly cut with like 18 hours of footage. But of course, you know, I mean, you know, it was never intended for it to be that long. So it's like a lot of that never would have been in it. But so it's not like there was really an 18-hour version so much as that's the raw, unedited stuff. But you know, like some of these sequences, you know, even as a 2 hours and change movie, the original version is still laser focused. You know, even as you have all these episodic things, you know, Willard's is kind of Odyssey like, right? He's going and having these various encounters. It's still all framed in this is the journey to Kurtz and what's that going to be. Whereas a lot of the stuff that's added in this version feels like it actively detracts from that, in my opinion.
Yep.
I think the French plantation sequence, maybe if it was shorter, could still be okay. But
it's almost like this, like quick, like odd reprieve from Boney, where you're kind of
like, that's what it feels like, is a reprieve for sure.
Right, but it lasts so long that it becomes uncomfortable.
Yeah.
You know, and you're like, well, what are we doing here? If it just sort of existed, you know, when then it's fine. When you're like, you're barreling down this path and then you're kind of like stopping, like, whoa, what is this? Like this juxtaposition. And you're like, wait, okay. So this jungle isn't all like there's this other like kind of weird part to it. That's kind of off-putting and like, okay, and then we move on as opposed to like, just keep going and going and making it really like odd. Yeah.
Yeah. It's too easy for the crew, right? There's no tension in that sequence. So in any event, I mean, I think that we're on the same page then, that we would tell, if you haven't watched this movie, you absolutely should, but what you should watch is the original version. And then if you're still really interested in seeing the other version, yeah, sure, watch it. But I think the first one is by far the superior version.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, so even though I could go on and on and on about this movie, let's move on to number 29, Double Indemnity, 1950 drama, sort of at the tail end of, 1944, tail end of some of what we think of as film noir. It's a mystery starring Fred MacMurray, and he's not the jokey, affable dad like in My Three Sons, which is how I grew up knowing Fred MacMurray on Nick at Night. So I had seen this movie before, but this was your first time seeing it. So what did you think?
So I liked this movie. I was struggling to figure out, like, obviously you have to take the movie in as a whole. You know, when I first started watching it, I got into the story. I was like, why is this so high on the list? You know, I mean, not because I'm not enjoying it, but I'd also just watched Apocalypse Now a couple of days earlier.
Yeah.
And I'm watching this and I'm like, so it's entertaining. It's a very good movie. What I guess I feel like I haven't done any research as to like what is the reason why it's on the list. You know, I haven't read any background on that. So my guess is is that this must have been one of the first times that there was a complexity to this like film noir murder, because I mean, it's basically, I mean, it kind of felt like, I mean, this is going to be a weird comparison, but it kind of felt like a movie like Gone Girl, where it's like,
I would definitely say it's that same sort of genre thriller.
Yeah, exactly. It's this thriller that like leads you down one path, starts to unravel all these other paths and all these different motivations of characters that isn't what you even originally thought. Like if you tried to predict the end game, you could never have gotten there because of how, and I like that. And I feel like it's this high because I guess maybe it must have kickstarted that complexity of a plot.
I think, I mean, 1944, there was sort of plenty of sort of film noir style, like mysteries and thrillers, before that. Part of what was going on that's a little bit interesting. Well, first of all, it's written and directed by Billy Wilder. So, that's part of it just there. But part of what was going on is that it was very mature in content compared to a lot. And even with like some of the stuff in this movie that like for example, did they actually sleep together or not? There's no hard evidence given in the movie, although I think the implication is there, but it's certainly never confirmed in any clear way.
Right. But some of that has to do with just like how you had to make movies at that time.
Well, right. No, exactly it is. But the point is that I think one of the things that was true about this movie at the time that it was made is that it was really towing the line. Like for example, the fact that this guy, this insurance salesman, like some of the opening stuff, like he shows up at this house, and the wife of the guy he's there to see, he's basically, she comes out in a towel and he's like, oh, your husband's not home, huh? Sure. I'll hang out for a little while, and he's just totally, creeping on her, right? Except she's kind of into it and it's complex. And so like just even some of that stuff was really edgy for what audiences at that time were used to. So I think that's part of it. What I will say is that I think if I'm gonna criticize this movie for a moment, I think some of the opening stuff, like having a framing device of the voiceover where we start with him knowing that it's all gonna go horribly wrong somehow. So we know, even as we flash back to watch the story, we know because we've already seen him that something's going horribly wrong. I think some of those early sequences are a little clumsy. Like in theory, he's supposed to be shot and maybe even bleeding out, but they really don't show very much of that. So we kind of have to just assume it by the way he's kind of moving. I think some of that's a little clumsy, but overall, I think just the intrigue of it, the lack, Edward G. Robinson, if anyone, is the hero of this story.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, he's the guy who has actually got real empathy and humanity, even for this guy who he's going to put away. Although it's funny these days to think of the guy who investigates insurance fraud as the good guy, because you got to get all those scammers, as opposed to the insurance companies looking for ways to cheat anybody out of claims, right? Which is a more modern narrative.
Right.
But in any case, I think just the performances are sort of very distinctive and interesting, I think. And just the intricacy of the plot and seeing it kind of fall apart. And so like we talked about with Maltese Falcon, the nature of their relationship, I think, is interesting because it's easy to potentially look at it at sort of a very face value level, as we might be encouraged to do with a lot of movies of this time period, which is they don't necessarily set up any kind of actual chemistry necessarily with two actors. If they say they're in love, okay, well, they're in love now. We just take it for face value. But in this movie, I think it really does want us to wonder at the end what they ever really did feel about each other, because to a large extent, I don't know that they really ever did love each other as people, ever. There was initially some physical attraction, but then I think once there was the idea that there was maybe this murder plot, I think they were both more in love with the idea of getting to do something like that than they really ever cared about the other person. But then there's the complexity at the end for her
of knowing that she's done this
where
before.
But also what I was thinking is like the very last scene with her where she has already shot him once and finds that she can't pull the trigger again. And she is mystified herself because she thought that she was the one that didn't really feel anything. And yet now she can't bring herself to kill him, even though he is about to kill her.
Right.
And so I think that there's an interesting complexity there. And on top of that, just, his own sort of like reaction to that, and sort of the recognizing, even in his, he says in his opening narration, the whole idea was I was supposed to get the girl and get the money. But the way he says it, it's like, it's a thing. It's not like I get her, it's I get the girl, right? And I get the money as abstract concepts because that's a cool thing to do, as opposed to having any real emotional investment in this specific crime. And I think there's some interesting complexity there. And I think maybe that's why. I mean, I'm not going to keep it this high on the list. I like it a lot, but I tend to agree with you. I think there are other movies that are better. But I think that those things are maybe probably part of why. But I think also just Billy Wilder's, got some clout, right?
Yeah, some clout. I mean, and that's the thing, is it's not a bad movie. Like, I didn't watch it and be like, what am I wasting my time with this?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I enjoyed my time watching the movie.
Mm-hmm.
We're at a point in the list where I want to feel like I did in Apocalypse Now. I want to feel like I did in Godfather 2. I want those things out of these movies, and like, where we're coming up, like, things were, All About Eve and High Noon aren't great examples, but we're coming up on like To Kill a Mockingbird, E.T., Grapes of Wrath, Some Like It Hot. Like, these are things that are just Chinatown. Like, these are movies that just like take you on, and this movie didn't do that.
For me, almost it feels almost a little bit like a stand-in for a kind of movie than it is representative of itself as a great film. That's kind of how it feels to me. It's almost a little bit like what I was saying about like why I liked Maltese Falcon so much, which was just to say, I like that kind of movie, and this is a good one of those. And I kind of feel the same way about this one.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly what I was thinking. Like, I looked at it and I said, and that's why I said, I think this is on the list because it, just like the Maltese Falcon, like with that whole idea that the Maltese Falcon was a red herring, like that just injects something new into the film noir and what comes later. This does the same thing. Like, it allows you to have a complex female character, a complex relationship with the male character, while still attributing all the themes of film noir. Your complexity levels are different, and how the plot actually turns out is, with the little twist at the end. Like, these are things that feel somewhat commonplace now, but were not a thing back then. So I respect all of that. Mm-hmm. But does that make it the number 29 movie on the list? Like,
no, I agree. I'm not going to keep it that high, but I mean, it has some really stunning sequences. Like, for example, when they think they've gotten away with it, and he decides that they're safe enough that he can invite her up to his apartment, but before she arrives, Keyes gets there and says, "I got a funny feeling the little man won't let me alone," and he's realizing she is on her way up. And if he sees her, it gives the whole game away.
Yes.
And so that sequence, and even though they had to kind of fudge that, it's kind of a fire code thing that apartment doors open in, so it doesn't really make any sense that his opens out just so she can hide behind it. But okay. Anyway, it's an exciting sequence, even with that little bit of Hollywood fudging. So I definitely noticed that, just because it's kind of a thing. But at the same time, that whole bit, though, where Neff is having this conversation with Keyes and is like, "Go ahead, get in the elevator because she's hiding right behind the door and I don't want you to see her. Come on, go on. But I can't let you know that I'm trying to get you to leave." And, some good stuff there. And just the whole, I think it's a good murder plot, I think, is kind of fun. You know what I mean? Just like the idea of it and just the various ins and outs of how it all works. The idea of, watching them make a smart plan that nonetheless, doesn't work out, primarily just due to the intuition and smarts of an actual decent guy. And
yeah, who actually goes through and like, he basically goes through and says, like, if you had to troubleshoot my murder plot, how would you do it? Except after the fact, like they went through, and so he comes through and he's like, well, the train wasn't going fast enough, but I was trying to figure out, well, how did this happen? How could he have gotten there? Well, it could have been someone else because the train wasn't going fast enough. He could have just jumped off the train, and you just watch, like, as these guys are watching him sort of unravel their plot.
Yeah. You see Fred McMurray doing a fairly nuanced performance for 1944 of, that might be. And I have totally no connection to it at all. I'm interested because anyone would be, right? Because it's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And just all of this stuff too about, like the guy who saw him on the train just waiting outside the office the one day and was like, "Oh, I'm going to kind of try to stand where I'm not pointing at you so you don't see my face, except I guess that's how you saw me before on the train too. So I don't know what to." Anyway. So I think that, I think there's a lot of good stuff in it. I agree with you generally. I don't think it belongs this high. Especially Billy Wilder's got plenty of other movies on this list. We already talked about The Apartment, and we still got Sunset Boulevard and Some Like It Hot to come. So
that's his best.
Some Like It Hot? Yeah, it's pretty good.
We'll get to that, but yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty good. But anyway, I just mean, it's not like we have to keep this movie high to show Billy Wilder some love. He's doing okay on the list. But yeah, I like it. I think it's especially if people are into noir, it's a little bit. One of the things that it does that I think is interesting about noir is that there's really no lots of times these noir stories like Maltese Falcon have the main character, the protagonist, be kind of an anti-hero, right? Like Sam Spade is not a nice man,
right?
But he's trying to do the right thing, right? In the end, what he wants is for the bad guys to go down, because that's how it's supposed to go, right? Neff is a sleazeball, right? Pretty much his sole redeeming quality is that he recognizes in Keyes kind of a comrade, like that relationship between those two is interesting. And I think is really the most genuine thing in the movie.
Right. I mean, he is like when people use the joke, like insurance salesman, as like what a sleazy person. Like that is what he is, you know?
Bruce Campbell in Evil Dead, like the whole like shtick he's doing as Ash Williams, like feels modeled after Fred McMurray's, the way he talks in this. He calls her baby all the time and is like, "Come on, baby, you know we got to do this." You know, that whole sort of thing. I mean, you know, the line from, you know, Evil Dead where he's like, "Give me some sugar, baby." You know, it's like, it's right. It's exactly how Fred McMurray talks in this movie. It's very stylized, but it feels in the movie like a put on, right? Like he is doing a thing. He is a badass who has come up with a genius plan, and he's going to get to kill someone, get the money and the girl. And how awesome is that? He is such a cool guy, is what he's thinking of himself through most of the movie, until obviously it starts to unravel, and which point he's going like, "Oh crap, I screwed up." But yeah, I don't know that I have a lot more to say about it. It is kind of fun seeing Edward G. Robinson play a nice guy, just because he kind of had a reputation for playing gangsters and stuff.
We'll see him again.
Yep. So so I guess that we'll leave it there, and so we can go ahead and do our rankings. You know where you're putting stuff?
I do.
Yeah.
I'm going extremes on this one.
Ooh.
So Apocalypse Now stays where it is.
Nice.
Or I guess technically moves up.
Well, yeah, I mean, once Double Indemnity moves down.
Double Indemnity, I am putting at 100.
Okay, so
I'm
before Sullivan's Travels?
Yes. So I'm leaving it in the list, but taking it to the very end, because I do respect the quality of the movie and what it brings to the table. But I mean, even just look at our conversation. Like we talked for an hour and a half about Apocalypse Now, and 20 minutes.
Could easily talk more about it too. You know?
Yeah, and we could have gone on. You know, so the juxtaposition, like this, just needs. Yes, leave it on the list. Put it at the end. I'm good. So.
Okay. I'm not going to lower it quite so much, but I am going to put it at. Let's see, where do I want to put it? I think that I'm going to put it after Platoon, but before Sullivan's Travels.
So in the 80s still?
Yeah. And then Apocalypse Now, as much as I absolutely adore it and it's one of my favorite movies, I don't think I can put it. I think I'm going to put it between Doctor Strangelove and Shawshank. So it's one down. But Doctor Strangelove, I love that one so much too.
It's your list.
Yep, it is. It is. It's my list. Nobody else's. It's mine. Suddenly that made me want to go into Mikey's Goonies monologue, and you know, like, up there it's their time. Their time up there. But it's our time down here.
Down here.
Yeah. Okay, so technically for me, Apocalypse Now stays right where it is at number 30.
Yep.
Okay. I did something wrong. Okay, there it is. It's because I have a double Sullivan's Travels now. Yeah. Okay. All right. So yes, my resulting list is Double Indemnity at, where did I just put it? I screwed up. Yeah, I definitely screwed that up. Okay. Double Indemnity at 82. And Apocalypse Now at 30. You have Double Indemnity at number 100 and Apocalypse Now at 29. So next time we'll be talking about All About Eve, 1950 drama. that I have seen and you have not, and High Noon, 1952 Western that neither of us have seen.
Yep.
One of the last ones where that's the case. I think the only other one that neither of us have seen that's left is The General, which is the Buster Keaton movie.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so well, that'll do it for this time. So thank you, everybody, for listening and or watching, and go out and watch good movies.
Yep.